At 18 years old, Martina Navratilova walked into the biggest tennis tournament in America with a racket bag, a teenage face, and a problem most athletes never have to solve. If she went home to Czechoslovakia, the state could tighten its grip on her career. If she stayed in the United States, she might lose her country, her family, and the life she knew. So during the 1975 U.S. Open, while the tennis world was watching scores and draws, Navratilova made a decision that changed not just her career, but the history of women's tennis. She asked the United States for political asylum. This is the story of how a teenager from behind the Iron Curtain chose freedom over certainty, why that choice cost her far more than most fans realized, and how the lonely years that followed helped create one of the greatest careers tennis has ever seen. The surprising part is that her escape did not look like the dramatic scenes people imagine when they hear the words Iron Curtain. There was no midnight tunnel, no sprint through a forest, no guard tower in the distance. There was a tennis tournament. There were locker rooms, practice courts, hotel rooms, reporters, agents, and officials. And somewhere inside that ordinary sports machinery, Martina Navratilova saw her opening. To understand why an 18-year-old tennis player would risk exile in the middle of a Grand Slam, you have to understand what tennis meant in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. It was not just a sport, it was a privilege controlled by the state. Czechoslovakia was a communist country, locked behind the political barrier the West called the Iron Curtain. Travel was restricted. Careers were supervised. Athletes who competed abroad did not simply book a flight and chase prize money. They were representatives of the system. Their movements, their income, and their public behavior could be monitored or controlled. For a young player with rare talent, tennis could open the world, but it could also make that world feel painfully close and still out of reach. Martina was born in Prague in 1956, in what was then Czechoslovakia. Her early life was shaped by tennis almost from the beginning. Her family was athletic, and she grew up in an environment where the game was not a casual hobby. It was a craft. It was discipline. It was repetition. It was the sound of a ball coming off strings again and again until timing became instinct. She was left-handed, strong, aggressive, and unusually willing to come forward. Even as a young player, she did not fit the softer stereotypes often placed on women's tennis. She wanted the net. She wanted angles. She wanted to attack. That style mattered, because Martina Navratilova's future greatness was never going to come from playing safely inside someone else's lines. Her tennis was built on movement toward risk, and her life would follow the same pattern. By her teenage years, she was already good enough to draw attention outside her country. That attention created opportunity, but also pressure. A communist sports system could celebrate an international champion, but it also expected obedience. Success belonged partly to the athlete and partly to the state. The young Navratilova could travel because she was valuable. She could compete abroad because she was useful, but that did not mean she was free. In interviews and later accounts, Navratilova has described feeling controlled by officials and limited by the system around her. As with many stories from the Cold War, details can vary depending on who is telling them and when, but the larger picture is clear. She believed her future in tennis would be restricted if she stayed under Czechoslovak control, and by 1975, that belief had turned into a crisis. She was only 18, but she was not unknown. She had already shown enough promise that people in tennis could see she was not a temporary story. She was powerful. She was ambitious. She was learning fast. But the better she became, the more complicated her life became. A mediocre player might have been ignored. A great player could become a symbol. That was the trap. If Navratilova became a world-class star while remaining under state authority, her career could be shaped by people who did not share her ambitions. They could decide where she played. They could decide when she traveled. They could pressure her to return. They could limit her earnings. They could use her victories as propaganda, while denying her the independence that had made those victories possible. For a teenager looking at the world from inside that system, the choice was brutal. Stay and keep family, language, home, and belonging. Leave and maybe become the player she knew she could be. But leaving meant she might not be able to go back. That is what makes the 1975 U.S. Open so important. It was not just another tournament stop. It was a rare moment when she was physically in the United States, close enough to request protection, visible enough that her case would be noticed, and talented enough that American tennis people understood what was at stake. She was in New York for the U.S. Open. The tournament then was still in its Forest Hills era, before the modern stadium complex in Flushing Meadows became the symbol of American tennis. It had a different feel, but it was already a major stage. And for Navratilova, the stage had two matches happening at once. On court, she was competing against the best players in the world. Off court, she was weighing whether to break from her country. Imagine the pressure inside that decision. At 18, most players are worried about nerves, rankings, prize money, coaches, and whether they can handle a big match. Navratilova was thinking about asylum. That word is easy to say now, after we know how the story turned out. But in the moment, asylum meant uncertainty. It meant lawyers, government officials, headlines, and diplomatic attention. It meant being seen as a defector, not just a tennis player. It meant that people back home might be punished socially or watched more closely because of her choice. It meant that her family relationships could be strained or interrupted by politics she could not control. It also meant emotional isolation. A tennis player can change countries on paper, but they cannot instantly replace childhood. They cannot replace the streets they knew, the language they dreamed in, the people who saw them before the world did. Navratilova was not simply choosing America. She was choosing a future where the cost would arrive slowly. At first, the public saw the headline, "Young Czech tennis player asks for asylum," but the private consequences were much heavier. She was cut off from normal life with her family. Communication across that political divide was difficult. Visits were not simple. Years could pass under the weight of bureaucracy, suspicion, and distance. Her mother and relatives remained in Czechoslovakia, while Martina tried to build a life in a country that offered freedom, but not comfort. That is the part of the story people often skip. Freedom did not make her instantly happy. It made her responsible for everything. In Czechoslovakia, the system had controlled too much. In America, suddenly, no one controlled enough. She had to figure out money, training, diet, coaching, travel, language, culture, public image, and the loneliness of being a teenager in exile. And the tennis world was not gentle. The United States gave Navratilova opportunity, but it also judged her. She did not arrive as a polished marketing product. She was young, emotional, physically strong, and visibly different from the tidy image many sponsors preferred in women's tennis at the time. She struggled with fitness. She struggled with food. She struggled with pressure. She was sometimes criticized for her body. She was sometimes described in ways that revealed more about the biases of the era than about her tennis. And there was another layer. Navratilova would later become one of the most prominent openly gay athletes in the world. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, that carried real commercial and social consequences. Public attitudes were harsh. Sponsors were cautious. The sports establishment was not built to protect athletes who challenged its preferred image. So when people say Navratilova escaped to freedom, that is true, but incomplete. She escaped political control. She did not escape judgment. She escaped the state deciding her future. She did not escape the world trying to define who she was allowed to be. That tension became fuel. At first, Chris Evert was the standard in women's tennis. Evert was calm, consistent, elegant, and ruthless from the baseline. She was America's tennis star, a player who could absorb pressure and turn it back with clean, repeated precision. Navratilova was different. She was explosive. She came forward. She served and volleyed. She looked for the short ball, attacked the net, and tried to end points before they settled into rhythm. Against Evert, that style created one of the defining rivalries in tennis history. But early on, Navratilova did not always have the discipline to match her talent. She could be brilliant and vulnerable in the same afternoon. She had the shots, but not yet the complete machine. That is where the story becomes more than a defection story. Because leaving Czechoslovakia gave her access to freedom, but freedom alone did not make her great. She had to rebuild herself. The teenage defector had to become a professional in the deepest sense. She had to learn what to eat, how to train, how to recover, how to handle pressure without a state system, without the old structure, and without the emotional safety of home. She had to decide what kind of champion she wanted to be. And then, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Navratilova began turning into something women's tennis had never quite seen before. She took fitness seriously in a way that pushed the sport forward. She worked on strength. She worked on endurance. She sharpened her serve. She refined her volley. She became faster, leaner, more durable, and more tactically complete. She did not simply play tennis. She professionalized her body for tennis. That sounds normal now, because modern players live inside teams of trainers, physios, nutritionists, and performance coaches. But in that era, Navratilova's commitment helped change expectations. She showed that women's tennis could be more physically demanding, more athletic, and more aggressive than many people had imagined. Her game became pressure, not just shot pressure, time pressure. She took time away from opponents by moving forward. She made them pass under stress. She forced them to hit precise shots again and again, knowing that if they left the ball floating even slightly, she would close and finish the point. A baseline player could make you miss. Navratilova could make you panic, and the results started to pile up. Her first Wimbledon singles title came in 1978 when she beat Chris Evert in the final. That win mattered because Wimbledon suited her attacking game. Grass rewarded her serve, her left-handed angles, her reflexes, and her instinct at the net. But it mattered for another reason. It proved that the defector was not just a political story. She was a champion. Then she won Wimbledon again in 1979, once more defeating Evert in the final. Still, even after those victories, her full domination had not arrived. She remained a player of immense talent who was still becoming. The gap between very good and historically great is not one shot. It is 1,000 decisions repeated for years. Navratilova kept making those decisions. By the early 1980s, everything began to align. Her fitness improved. Her confidence hardened. Her tactical identity became clearer. She was no longer a gifted attacker searching for consistency. She was a complete champion who could impose her terms on almost anyone. The numbers from her prime are still difficult to absorb. She won 18 Grand Slam singles titles across her career. She won 31 Grand Slam women's doubles titles. She won 10 Grand Slam mixed doubles titles. That makes 59 major titles in total, a record in the Open era. She won 9 Wimbledon singles titles, more than any other singles player in Wimbledon history. She won 167 singles titles on the WTA Tour, widely recognized as a record. She also won 177 doubles titles, another staggering mark. These numbers are not just statistics. They show the scale of the transformation. The teenager who risked everything for control over her own career became a player who controlled the sport. But the most revealing part of Navratilova's greatness may be this. She did not dominate in only one format. Some champions are singles legends. Some are doubles specialists. Navratilova became both. In singles, she was a relentless attacker. In doubles, she was a genius of space, timing, and anticipation. Her net play, already lethal in singles, became even more valuable when paired with a partner. She understood angles before they opened. She moved like she could see the point 2 shots ahead. That matters because doubles is often treated as secondary by casual fans, but it exposes tennis intelligence in a different way. You cannot win that much doubles by being merely athletic. You have to read, adjust, cover, communicate, and strike under pressure. Navratilova did all of it for decades. And that word, decades, is important. Her career did not burn bright and disappear. It stretched across eras. She won major titles as a teenager, as a dominant world number 1, and even as an older player competing in mixed doubles long after most athletes would have retreated into commentary boxes and ceremonial appearances. Her final major title came at the U.S. Open in mixed doubles in 2006, when she was nearly 50. That detail sounds almost impossible, but it fits the larger story. Navratilova's career was built on refusing the timeline other people assigned to her. A communist system had tried to limit where she could go. The tennis establishment tried to decide how she should look. Sponsors and commentators tried to package or punish her identity. Age tried to close the door. She kept coming forward. That was her game, and in many ways, it was her life. But to understand the emotional cost, go back to 1975. When Navratilova asked for asylum, she was not yet the icon we remember now. She did not know she would become a 9-time Wimbledon singles champion. She did not know she would build one of the most complete records in tennis. She did not know that decades later, people would talk about her as a symbol of courage. She was an 18-year-old making a decision without proof that it would work. That is the part that gives the story its force. It is easy to admire risk after success has made it look wise. At the time, risk looked like loss. She lost the ability to return home freely. She lost daily contact with her family. She lost the protection of belonging to a familiar culture. She lost the simple comfort of being understood without explanation. And she gained a future that had no guarantees. The United States could offer opportunity, but opportunity is not the same as acceptance. She still had to win. She still had to adapt. She still had to survive the loneliness of exile and the scrutiny of fame. For years, her personal story and her tennis story moved together. The more she won, the more visible she became. The more visible she became, the more people judged not only her forehand and serve, but her body, her personality, her politics, and her private life. Many athletes talk about pressure. Navratilova lived inside several kinds at once. There was competitive pressure. Could she beat Evert? Could she win Wimbledon again? Could she stay number one? Could she hold off the next generation? There was political pressure. Could she speak honestly about the country she left without endangering people she loved? Could she be grateful to America while still carrying the pain of exile? Could she build a new citizenship while remembering an old home? There was cultural pressure. Could she be herself in a sports world that preferred women athletes to be marketable in narrow ways? Could she be strong without being mocked for strength? Could she be open in an era when openness could cost money and reputation? That combination would have broken many careers. In Navratilova, it appears to have created a harder edge. She became famous not only for winning, but for refusing to shrink. And that refusal is connected to the defection. Not because one decision explains an entire life, but because the 1975 choice revealed a pattern. When the available path was too small, Navratilova did not simply accept it. She crossed into a larger one, even when the crossing hurt. The Cold War background makes this story feel historical, almost distant, but the human question inside it is still current. Who owns an athlete's talent? Is it the country that trains them? The system that funds them? The fans who claim them? The sponsors who sell them? The family that sacrifices for them? Or the athlete herself? Navratilova's answer was radical for an 18-year-old. Her talent belonged to her. That did not mean she owed nothing to others. No athlete rises alone. Coaches, family, clubs, competitors, and institutions all shape a career. But there is a difference between support and possession. Navratilova's defection was, at its core, a rejection of possession. She wanted the right to choose where to play, how to develop, what to say, and who to become. That choice had political meaning because of the world she came from, but it also had personal meaning that extends beyond politics. It was a demand for authorship. And once she had that authorship, she wrote a career almost too large to summarize. Her rivalry with Chris Evert became one of the richest in sports. They played each other 80 times, a number that would be almost unthinkable for many modern rivalries. Their contrast made each other better. Evert's discipline forced Navratilova to refine her aggression. Navratilova's athletic attack forced Evert to find answers under pressure. For years, women's tennis was partly defined by that contrast. Baseline against net, composure against force, control against invasion. But even that framing is too simple, because both players were more complex than their stereotypes. Evert was tougher than her calm image suggested. Navratilova was more thoughtful than her power suggested. Together, they pushed the sport into a more serious competitive era. Then came Steffi Graf, another kind of challenge. Graf's forehand, speed, and mental efficiency represented the next wave. Navratilova had to fight not only rivals her own age, but the future arriving early. She did not win every battle. No champion does. But her longevity meant she remained relevant across changes in racket technology, training standards, court conditions, media expectations, and playing styles. That is another reason her 1975 decision matters. If she had stayed under tighter control, would she have had the same freedom to adapt, the same access to coaching and competition, the same ability to shape her body and schedule around peak performance? No one can prove the alternate history, but it is reasonable to say that Asylum gave her the independence to pursue the career on her own terms. That independence did not make winning easy. It made winning possible at the highest level. There is a difference. A lot of people think freedom means removing obstacles. Navratilova's story shows something sharper. Freedom often means choosing which obstacles are worth facing. She traded one set of constraints for another. She left political restriction and gained exile. She left state control and gained public scrutiny. She left a familiar home and gained an unfamiliar arena. But those new obstacles, painful as they were, at least belonged to a life she had chosen. That is why the U.S. Open setting is so striking. The tournament is built around individual competition. One player stands alone across the net from another. Coaches can help before the match, but in the decisive moments, the player must serve, move, think, and choose. In 1975, Navratilova made a choice off-court that looked very much like her tennis. She stepped forward. She took the ball early. She accepted that a safe rally might not save her, and once she did, there was no simple way back. The personal reconciliation with her homeland was slow and complicated, as it often was for defectors from communist countries. Over time, the world changed. Czechoslovakia's communist regime eventually fell in 1989 during the Velvet Revolution. The country later separated peacefully into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Navratilova's relationship with her birthplace could exist in a new political reality, but the years lost in between were real. History can explain them, it cannot refund them. That is the cost hidden inside the trophy count. When you see 18 major singles titles, you see victory. When you see 9 Wimbledon titles, you see dominance. When you see 59 total majors, you see greatness. But behind those numbers is a teenager who had to accept that greatness might require separation from home before she knew whether greatness would come at all. That is what makes Navratilova's story different from a simple sports biography. It is not just talented player works hard and wins. It is talented player realizes the system around her may limit the life she can build, then pays the price to leave before the world can promise her a reward. The timing is everything. If she had waited until she was older, the state might have restricted her travel. If she had left earlier, she might not have had the tennis standing to support herself. If she had failed after leaving, the story might have been remembered as tragedy or footnote. Instead, she turned the opening into a career, and not a small one. A career that changed how women trained. A career that showed net-rushing aggression could dominate at the highest level. A career that expanded what a female athlete could look like, say, and survive. A career that stretched long enough to become almost a living bridge between eras. The lesson is not that every risk works. That would be too easy and not true. The lesson is that some ambitions cannot survive inside permission. Navratilova did not become great because she defected. She became great because after defecting, she did the harder thing. She built the discipline to justify the risk. That is where the story resolves. The asylum request gave her space. The work filled it. Freedom opened the door. Training, courage, adaptation, and stubbornness carried her through it. And maybe that is why her legacy still feels alive. She was not a perfect symbol. No athlete is. She was complicated, direct, sometimes controversial, often fearless, and impossible to reduce to one headline. But the 18-year-old at the 1975 U.S. Open remains the key image. A young player in a foreign country, carrying a racket and a decision. Behind her, a system that wanted control. In front of her, a future that offered no guarantees. She chose the future. Then she spent the rest of her career proving she had been right to claim it. If this story stayed with you, look up Navratilova's rivalry with Chris Evert next. It is one of the clearest examples of how two opposite styles can push a sport forward.